What would you do if the person you love most in the world needed saving, but you were all alone? Bruce sat by his mother's bedside, holding her hand as though his grip alone could keep her tethered to him. The dimly lit apartment was silent, save for the faint sound of Chloe's laboured breathing. At just 8 years old, Bruce had already learned what loss felt like. He wasn't ready to feel it again. "Don't worry, Mum," he whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "I'll figure it out. I promise life had never been easy for Bruce." The crumbling apartment they called home was a testament to years of struggle, but none of that mattered when Chloe was with him. She was his anchor, his warmth, his whole world. And now, she was slipping away. Her rare disease had come without warning, leaving her unresponsive and fragile. No relatives to call, no neighbours to turn to. Just Bruce, alone, against a world that seemed to have forgotten them. He flipped through the worn pages of a phone book he'd found in a drawer, pressing the buttons of a clunky old phone with shaking hands. Line after line, the answer was the same. No help, no hope. "Please," he begged into the receiver, his voice cracking. "She's really sick." A dull tone buzzed in response. He slammed the receiver down, his small frame trembling with frustration and fear. But there was no time to cry. Bruce wiped his face with his sleeve, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cold. Stay tuned to see how Bruce fights against impossible odds to save his mother. And if his story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of courage and hope. Bruce weaved through the crowded streets, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with the address of the nearest hospital. His sneakers slapped against the pavement, his breath puffing in the chilly air. When he finally reached the hospital, the large, sterile lobby felt overwhelming. Adults bustled past him, their hurried footsteps echoing against the tiles. "Can I help you, kid?" the receptionist asked, barely looking up from her desk. Bruce hesitated but forced the words out. "Please, my mum is really sick. She needs a doctor." Moments later, paramedics followed Bruce back to the apartment. They carefully loaded Chloe onto a stretcher as Bruce clung to her hand until the very last moment. He followed the ambulance to the hospital, his small figure dwarfed by the towering building. Inside, as doctors began assessing his mother, Bruce stood in the corner of the waiting room, hugging his knees to his chest. For now, Chloe was in safe hands. But Bruce had no idea that the real fight was just beginning. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of machines monitoring Chloe's fragile state. Bruce sat on a cold plastic chair by the bedside, his legs dangling above the floor. His eyes, red and puffy from hours of crying, stayed fixed on his mother's face. She looked so still, so far away. He couldn't let her go. A nurse stepped in, her kind smile doing little to mask the weight of what she was about to say. "We're doing everything we can, sweetheart. The doctors are working hard to help your mom." Bruce nodded silently, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. He wanted to believe her, but the hollow pit in his stomach told him things weren't that simple. A short time later, a doctor approached him. His white coat looked crisp, but his expression was heavy. Bruce stood up, trying to look braver than he felt. "The medicine your mother needs is very specialized," the doctor explained gently. "It's not something we usually have here, and it's expensive." "How expensive?" Bruce asked, his voice small but steady. The doctor hesitated, then knelt to meet Bruce's gaze. "It's a lot of money, son. Do you have anyone who can help you? Family? Friends?" Bruce shook his head. "It's just me and her." The doctor sighed, patting Bruce's shoulder before walking away. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "A lot of money." Bruce didn't even know what that meant, but he knew it was more than he had. He stayed by his mother's side as long as the hospital staff allowed, but eventually a nurse gently ushered him out. "We'll take good care of her," she said. Bruce nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets as he wandered back into the busy streets. The city felt colder than ever, the towering buildings looming over him like silent giants. Bruce's mind raced. He thought of the few things they had at home: a broken radio, some old clothes, maybe a watch his mom used to wear. Would anyone buy those? Would it even be enough? He wandered to a small park nearby, sitting on a bench as he watched people pass by. Families walked together, their laughter filling the air. Bruce's chest tightened. He wanted to shout, to tell someone, anyone, that he needed help. But no one seemed to notice the small boy sitting alone. Determined, Bruce stood up. He started asking strangers for help, his voice shaking as he explained his mother's situation. Some ignored him, others offered kind but empty words. A few gave him loose change, which he pocketed with a quiet, "Thank you." Hours passed, and Bruce's hope began to fade. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. He had to keep trying. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Bruce spotted a man in a sharp suit stepping out of a sleek black car. Something about the man's confident stride made Bruce hesitate, but desperation pushed him forward. "Excuse me, sir," Bruce called, his voice cracking. The man turned, raising an eyebrow. "My mom's really sick and I need help." The man studied Bruce for a moment, his expression unreadable. "What's your name, kid?" "Bruce," he replied. The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering. "Bruce, huh? You've got guts, I'll give you that." And with that, their paths crossed, a meeting that would change everything. Jimmy stared at the boy standing before him, his small frame trembling but his eyes unflinching. There was something in Bruce's voice, a mix of desperation and determination, that struck a chord deep inside him. He hadn't expected this encounter, nor did he have a reason to stop and listen, but something kept him rooted. "Your mom's sick, huh?" Jimmy said, crossing his arms as he looked Bruce up and down. The boy nodded, clutching his fists tightly. "She's in the hospital. They said she needs medicine, but it costs too much." Bruce's voice wavered, but he stood tall. "I'll do whatever it takes to get it for her." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. The boldness in this kid was surprising, especially for someone so young. He wasn't used to children speaking to him this way, or to children at all. "Whatever it takes, huh?" Jimmy muttered, half to himself. He glanced down at his expensive watch, then back at Bruce. "All right, kid, let's go see this hospital." Bruce hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll help?" "I didn't say that. I just want to see for myself," Jimmy replied, already turning toward his car. He opened the door and gestured for Bruce to get in. Bruce hesitated again. Something about this man made him uneasy. He seemed cold, detached. But he didn't have any other options. Climbing into the passenger seat, he buckled up, his small hands clutching the seatbelt tightly as the car sped off toward the hospital. When they arrived, Bruce led Jimmy through the sterile white halls to Chloe's room. She lay there, motionless, the machines around her beeping softly. Jimmy stepped inside, his confident stride slowing as he took in the sight. For a moment, he said nothing, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Bruce. "How long has she been like this?" "A few days," Bruce answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy's gaze lingered on Chloe. Something flickered in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in years. Memories he thought he'd buried started to surface, and with them, a gnawing sense of guilt. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Chloe," Bruce replied. "Do you know her?" Jimmy didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the bed, his mind racing. He remembered Chloe, their time together, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him when they were younger. And now, lying here, she looked like a shadow of the woman he'd once known. Bruce watched him carefully, suspicion starting to creep into his thoughts. Why do you care? Jimmy turned to face him, his jaw tightening. I think I knew her once. Bruce's eyes narrowed. If you knew her, where were you? Why didn't you help us before? The words hit Jimmy like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he didn't know? That he wasn't ready? I didn't know, he finally muttered, looking away. Bruce crossed his arms, his small face set with anger. Well, now you do. Are you going to help or not? Jimmy stared at the boy, his chest tightening. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling, the guilt, the confusion, the undeniable pull to do something. I'll figure it out, he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Bruce didn't thank him, didn't smile. He just nodded as if to say, you better. As they left the hospital room, Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. There was more to this, something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. Jimmy sat in his sleek office later that night, the city lights spilling through the large windows behind him. The image of Chloe in that hospital bed lingered in his mind, haunting him. Her face, pale and fragile, was a far cry from the vibrant woman he once knew. And then there was Bruce. The boy's fiery determination reminded Jimmy of someone he hadn't thought about in years. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Why now? He muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew why. He couldn't walk away from this. Not from Chloe, not from Bruce. The next morning, Jimmy returned to the hospital, his sharp suit drawing curious glances as he strode through the halls. Bruce was waiting in the corridor outside Chloe's room, his small figure slouched against the wall. When he saw Jimmy, his expression hardened. You said you'd figure it out, Bruce said, his tone sharp. Jimmy nodded, pulling out his phone. I've made some calls. The hospital will get the medicine she needs, but it's not just about buying the drugs. The doctors said it's a complicated treatment. It'll take time. Bruce's gaze didn't soften. How much time? Jimmy exhaled. We'll have to see how she responds, but it's a start. A nurse passed by, confirming the delivery of the medication, and Bruce's tense shoulders relaxed just a little. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope. Days turned into weeks as Chloe's treatment began. Bruce spent every waking moment by her side, watching intently as the nurses administered the medicine and checked the machines. He didn't understand most of what they were doing, but he clung to every small sign of progress, a steadier heartbeat, a deeper breath. Jimmy came by often, though his visits were usually brief. He would bring coffee for the nurses, books for Bruce, and updates from the doctors. At first, Bruce barely acknowledged him, but slowly, cracks began to form in the wall he had built. One afternoon, Jimmy found Bruce in the hospital cafeteria, poking at a tray of food. Sitting down across from him, Jimmy slid a chocolate bar across the table. You look like you could use this, Jimmy said. Bruce eyed the candy, then looked up at Jimmy. You don't have to keep coming here, you know. You already paid for the medicine. Jimmy hesitated. I'm not just here for that. I want to make sure you're okay. Bruce snorted, pushing the tray away. Why do you care now? Jimmy looked at him, the weight of years of regret settling in his chest. Because I should have cared a long time ago. I can't change the past, but I can try now. Bruce didn't respond right away. Instead, he unwrapped the chocolate bar, breaking off a piece. He took a bite, his expression softening just slightly. Over the next few days, their conversations became longer, less strained. Jimmy started telling Bruce stories, some about his work, some about when he was younger. Bruce listened, sometimes skeptical, sometimes curious. In the hospital room, Chloe's breathing grew stronger. Her hands, once limp, began to twitch faintly. The doctors called it progress, though they cautioned patience. Jimmy and Bruce found themselves spending more time together in the waiting room. They played card games with a deck Jimmy bought from the hospital gift shop. Bruce, still guarded, started sharing little details about his life, how he used to fix things around the house for Chloe, how he'd learned to cook simple meals because she worked so much. "She sounds like an incredible mom," Jimmy said one evening. "She is," Bruce replied firmly, glancing at the door to her room. "She's all I have." Jimmy wanted to say more, to tell Bruce he wasn't alone anymore, but he held back. There would be time for that, once Chloe woke up. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machines. Bruce sat beside Chloe's bed, his chin resting on the edge of the mattress. He was exhausted, but refused to leave her side. Every day he waited for a sign, even the smallest movement, that his mom would come back to him. Jimmy stood a few steps away, watching in silence. Over the past weeks, he had grown used to this routine. Bruce's quiet vigilance, the endless waiting. But today, something felt different. Then, it happened. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft groan escaping Chloe's lips. Bruce's head shot up, his eyes wide. "Mom?" he whispered, leaning closer. Chloe's fingers twitched, and her eyelids fluttered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Bruce!" Tears streamed down Bruce's face as he scrambled to his feet. "You're awake! Mom, you're awake!" The commotion drew a nurse into the room, who quickly checked Chloe's vitals, smiling reassuringly. "She's coming around," the nurse said. "She's still weak, but this is a good sign." Jimmy stepped closer, his heart pounding as he saw Chloe's eyes slowly open. She looked around the room, her gaze landing on Bruce first. A faint smile touched her lips. "My baby," she murmured, her voice cracking. Bruce hugged her carefully, afraid to hurt her. "I missed you so much," he sobbed. "I thought I was going to lose you." Chloe's hand rested weakly on his head. "I'm here now," she whispered. "Thanks to you." As the moment settled, Chloe's eyes shifted, catching sight of Jimmy. Her smile faded, replaced by confusion. "Jimmy?" Jimmy cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Hey, Chloe." He hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "It's been a while." Chloe's gaze flickered between him and Bruce, realization dawning in her tired eyes. "You helped him, didn't you?" Jimmy nodded. "I tried. I should have been there sooner, but..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I didn't know. About Bruce. About you being sick." Chloe's expression softened, though pain lingered in her eyes. "It's been 8 years, Jimmy. You didn't just disappear from my life. You disappeared from his." Bruce, still holding Chloe's hand, looked up at Jimmy. "Why did you leave?" Jimmy's shoulders sagged. "I was scared," he admitted. "I wasn't ready to be a father back then. I thought you'd be better off without me. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, Chloe sighed, her voice quiet but firm. "You hurt us, Jimmy. But you came back when it mattered, and that means something." Jimmy looked at her, guilt and hope battling in his eyes. "I want to make it right. For both of you. If you'll let me." Bruce glanced at his mother, his small face serious. "Can we trust him?" Chloe squeezed his hand. "It's not about forgetting the past, Bruce. It's about giving people a chance to change." Bruce studied Jimmy for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, but you better not leave again." A small smile tugged at Jimmy's lips. "I won't, I promise." In the days that followed, the three of them began piecing their lives back together. Jimmy helped Chloe transition out of the hospital, paying off her medical bills without hesitation. At home, he fixed things that had been broken for years, both in the apartment and in their hearts. Bruce began to trust Jimmy more with each passing day. They played card games together, cooked meals, and talked about everything Bruce had been through. Jimmy listened, his admiration for the boy growing with every story. Chloe, though still recovering, found herself smiling more often. The tension that had once weighed so heavily on her was easing. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. One evening, the three of them sat around the small kitchen table, sharing a meal. It wasn't fancy, just spaghetti and bread, but it felt like a feast. "To new beginnings," Jimmy said, raising his glass of water. Bruce and Chloe smiled, clinking their glasses against his. It wasn't a perfect ending. They still had scars, still had things to work through. But for the first time, they faced the future together, as a family.